So now we're going to learn Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis. We're going to try to figure out which din, in the case of Kala and Mumin, would support Shmuel that the Balach Hamor is responsible to bring a ride. If we're going to say it's Kala the base of Via, in other words, she exhibited these Mumin when she's still in her father's Rishus, and that's the Reisha of our Mishnah. And back on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Beis, we had the Shita of Rabbi Lazar to the effect that this din in the Reisha of the Mishnah would support and be reflective of the view of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua is the one who is unwilling to grant a kala the rights to haksuba because hamotzi mechaber of araya, even though she has a cheskes haguf and a tainus bari, to the effect that she lost her besulin, right? She was mensa after the erisin. That's a taina that's supported by cheskes haguf, but cheskes haguf loses out to cheskes moment. That's the shita of Yeshua, which is the shita that, according to Rabbi Lazar, we should identify as the shita of our Mishnah, the Reisha of our Mishnah. So even though she has already entered into the Rishus HaBaal, and it's after the Suin, nevertheless, if she develops, or if we discover Mumin, the father is going to have to prove that these Mumin came into being after the Nisuin and Istapcha Sadeu, and therefore the father wants to collect the Ksuba. He's Muksak in the Mamon. So that means, again, this is what we have to emphasize over and over and over again, that if we identify the ratio of the Mishnah with Rabbi Yeshua as Rabbi Lazar does, then the principle is that Cheskas Mamon is the Almighty, and the Cheskas Haguf loses out and is trumped by the Cheskas Mamon Amotzi Mechavel Varaya, even though the suffix was nolad in the Rishus of the Baal. Nevertheless, for the father to collect this ksuba, he has the burden of proof. Hamotzi Mechavel Varaya, if he wants to force the Baal to cough up the ksuba. And this despite the fact that the father's claim is supported by the Cheskas Haguf, which would indicate that she became a Ba'ula Tachta. Says Shmuel, from this halacha in our Mishnah, I'm sorry, when I said that she became a Ba'ula Tachta, I'm talking about the original Rabbi Yeshua, or in our context of our Mishnah, the Mum was developed before the Nisuin. Comes Shmuel with the following analysis, the following analogy. The Balach Hamor is going to have to bring the ride. When was the suffix nolad? It was after the Mashiachas HaPara. So in that sense, after the Mashiachas HaPara, the Baal HaPara already has a chazak on the Chamor. And why is that? Because, one second. Just one second. The only thing that confused me, he writes here that a chamor next to ka'omid b'shus bala pora. Why is the Chamor considered only B'Shus Bala Torah? Because what? Oh, I see. In other words, we don't know whether the Mashicha Sapora on the part of the Baal Chamor is a valid Mashicha, because it could be that his Chamor is already dead. So why is it that Shmuel says that the Baal Chamor has to prove it? It's because of the Chazaka of the Baal Par. What does that mean? It's the Baal Chamor who wants to claim ownership on the Parah. Until now, we understood that the Baal Parah owns the Parah. So if the Baal Chamor wants to undermine the status quo of the ownership of the Baal Parah, then he is coming to be mafkia the cheskes mamon, and we're going to apply the principle of hamotzi mechavel of haraya. So again, what we have to avoid being confused about is, let's not think that the Baal HaChamor became muhsak on the parah. No. We don't know whether that kinyan on the parah was valid or not. So that remains in doubt, up in the clouds, so to speak. What we do know is that the Baal HaParah had the cheskes mamon, what we call marakama, because it was always his parah. And therefore the Baal HaChamor has to prove that there's a change in status and to undermine the cheskes mamon of the Baal HaParah. And that, says Shmuel, I derive from the Mishnah of Kala, because even though she's already in the Rishus of the Baal, Rabbi Yeshua says, Hamotzi Mechavel of Haraya, and the Av is going to be the one who has to prove that he has rights to the Ksuba, because we postpone that change, that physical change, in Mum till the latest period of time. And why does the father carry the burden of proof, even though the suffix was no longer B'Shus HaBaal? And the answer is because the Baal is Muhsik in the Mammon. The Cheskes HaGuf supports the claim of the father that the Mum only came into being at the latest possible time after the Nisu, and it doesn't matter. Hamotzi Chaver all of her. Midami, the Gemara rejects this. There's no comparison or analogy between the two cases. Hasam, in the case of the Mishnah, Maisi, Ha'avraya, the reason why the burden of proof is on the father to bring evidence that the Mum came into being after the Erisin, Umapik, because he wants to collect the Ksuba from the Baal, and if he wants to be Motzi Mami Viches Kasa and collect the Ksuba, then he carries the burden of proof, and that makes 100% sense. But Shmuel has no right to derive any conclusions from that to Hacha, to the case of Machlut Par B'Chamor, where Shmuel paskins that the Baal HaChamor is responsible, he carries the burden to bring the Raya. Maisi Baal HaChamor Raya Umokiv. There, the Baal HaChamor in Shmuel's ruling has to bring a proof that the Chamor was alive at the time of the Mashiach Sapora, And that's the only way he can allow the part to remain his rishus. And that's the chiddush of Shmuel, that we completely disregard the fact that the kinyan of the Baal Chamor and the par was already effectuated, which means that the Baal Chamor is already possessing the para. So we would argue against Shmuel that the Baal Chamor does not carry the burden of proof, because the Baal Chamor is toughest on the para. He's already implemented the kinyan. Don't prove anything from the ksuba in our mission of the Kala, which imposes the burden of proof on the shoulders of the father, because that's a case where the father has no tfisa on the moment of ksuba. Amar Rabbi Abba, let's try a different tact. Perhaps Shmuel was not proving his conclusion about the Baal Chamor's Chovas Raya from the Reish of the Mishnah, but rather from the Seif of the Mishnah. Kala b'beis chamir. Right, so the Mishnah says that if she already entered into the Rishus HaBaal, which is called Beis Chamir. I'm not sure why they call it Beis Chamir. I mean, I understand that an unmarried woman lives in her father's house. I'm not sure that a woman who gets married lives in her father-in-law's house. I don't know exactly the sociology there, but in any event. So Rabbi Elazar says that the din of our Sefer in the Mishnah reflects the shita not of Rabbi Yeshua, but of Rabbi Gamliel, which means that Cheskas Guf is more powerful than the Cheskas Mammon, and that supports her claim of Nistapcha Sadeu, that these women only came into being after the Nisuin. So again, since the Cheskas Haguf supports the claim of the father for the collection of the Ksuba, that Cheskas Haguf, says Rabbi Elazar, attributing the Mishnah to Rabbi Gamliel, overrides the Cheskas Mammon and allows the father to collect the ksuba unless the Baal himself could prove that against the Cheskas Haguf, that she had these women already before the Eris. Now, we're going to have to accept on blind faith the following statement, which again, we'll have to analyze it at some other time. The suffix was nolad b'beis ha'ah, and the burden of proof is now carried by the Baal to prove that the mum already emerged b'beis ha'ah. Even though, keep in mind, it's the Baal who's coming to be machzik his own mammon. He's got the 200 zuz of the ksuba in his bank account. Nevertheless, he has to bring a rod. Why? Because the Av is supported by a Cheskas Haguf. Now let's add another element into the equation. Not only is the Av supported by the Cheskas Haguf, he's also supported by the Ksuba. The Shtar Ksuba is in his hands. And if the Baal wants to say that that Shtar Ksuba is invalid, then he, the Baal, carries the weight of the obligation of evidence to destroy the ksuba. And in the case of Safek, we have a right to assume that the Chiv ksuba is still intact. The Shtar ksuba is in the hands of the Av. and therefore yesh lahamid suffix ksuba al cheskas ksuba al cheskas baila havadon. So there was a vadai bow on this ksuba, and you want to, now the husband wants to undermine the validity of that ksuba, then he has the burden of proof. Comes along Shmuel, says Rabbi Abba, and he derives the following conclusion by equation. The machlek par b'chamor, the bal chamor is chayav to bring the raya. Why? He's coming to remove the bilus of the balapara on the para. Certainly in such a case, he should have to bring a proof in order to maintain ownership and possession on the para. Even though the suffix was not born in his rishus, and we're going to say that Nuki para b'cheskas bailin vadoy. Let me just review this one more time. According to Gamliel, trumps the Cheskas Mom. So I'll tell you, Rabbi Rhodes, I think this is what the Gemara is operating with, or Rabbi Abba is operating. And I hope I'm not misleading you, because I can't take a Shua Doraisa. So I'm up since 4 in the morning working on it. I think what the Gemara is assuming is that there's an equation between Cheskas Haguf and Cheskas Marakam. What does that mean? Cheskas Haguf tells me status quo. And that undermines the claim of the Baal as far as move is concerned. Status quo means she had a Cheskas Haguf, and any move that changes that Cheskas Haguf, that change should be delayed. And the same thing applies with regard to the Baal Para who has a Cheskas Marakama. He owned the Para. Any change in his ownership of the Para has to be proven. Just like the Cheskas Mammon of the Baal in Ksuba has to be proven, because the Ksuba is supported by a Cheskas Haguf of status quo that postpones the change in our body and the moon. So too, the Balapara has a chazaka similar to Cheskas Haguf in the fact that the para was always his. And if you want to undermine his situation, his bilus over the para, the burden of proof is on you. Hence, Shmuel derives the conclusion that the Balach Hamar has to bring the proof. And it's always the Kal V'chomer, because the Balach Hamar doesn't really have possession over the para. Because his possession of the para is contingent on the validity of the sale, which is in doubt. The Gemara rejects Rabbi Abba now. V'akati lo dami. Shmuel is not justified to derive his conclusion about the Balach Hamor from our Safi, our Mishnah Mumin, the Oda B'Beis Avir. Hasam in the din of the Mishnah, Baal Maisi Raya Umari Leila Chezke Dia. if the Baal wants to pater himself up from the ksuba, he must bring a proof in order to undermine the cheskes haguf that supports the father's claim for the validity of the ksuba. If he wants to prove that the mum had emerged before the nisuin, because the cheskes haguf supports the claim of the father that the mum emerged after the erisin based on the cheskes haguf, and the Baal is therefore chayvin ksuba. So it's crystal clear why the burden of proof is being carried by the Baal. But hacha, in the case of the suffix regarding the death of the chamor, there's no cheskes haguf to determine that the chamor died before the Mashiach of the Parah. So the Baal HaParah really has no support from a cheskes haguf. On the contrary, against the Baal HaParah, there's a cheskes haguf because the chamor is alive, and we assume that we postpone any change and that he died later and later. So at the time of the Mashiachas HaParah, the chamor was alive. And comes along Shmuel and he says, no, the Baal HaChamor, he's the one who has to bring a raya. Umokim cheske biyodeh. So this conclusion of Shmuel is not justified from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah imposes the the Chovas Haraya on the Baal because the Av has a cheskes haguf to support his claim. But here the Baal HaParah has no cheskes haguf to support his claim. On the contrary, if anybody has a cheskes haguf to support his claim, it's the Baal HaChamor. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Kala b'beis Aviyah. We're going to go back to our original assumption that Shmuel was proving it from Kala b'beis Aviyah. So again, let's go over. According to Rabbi Loza, that din reflects the Shita Rabbi Yoshua, that Cheskes Mammon is stronger and trumps a Cheskes Haguf. And that's why the father is obligated to bring a raya, because he wants to be Motzi Mammon Miches Kasa. And even though she has already entered into the Shus HaBaal, so that even though the Cheskes Haguf supports the Tainus Ha'av, that the Mumin were emerged after the Erisin, but nevertheless, because of the Cheskes Mammon, the burden of proof is carried by the Av. Ula Kiddushin. Okay. This Ula Kiddushin is a whole sugya unto itself, which would require an hour of learning. It's a sugya in Baba Basra Kuf Mem Hey, Machlokas Tanoim, in a case of a marriage where the money was given over to the Kala or to her father, and then after the Erisin, somebody died, the Kala the Chassan, and they never materialized the marriage. And the question is, does the Baal have rights to get back his money? Like I know a case in our family where a man engaged a girl. Again, this is not a halachic issue that's relevant to this, that's comparable to this. But anyway, so they broke the engagement and he wanted the ring back. And the question is whether he has rights to get the ring back. So that's a machlokas tanoim in the case of Kesef Kiddushin. Now, the father is holding on to the Kesef Kiddushin. The Baal is claiming that she has Mumin, and therefore it's a Mekach Tolos. I want my Kesef Kiddushin back. I want a return on my Kesef Kiddushin. And the father now has the burden of proof to establish his legal rights to the Kesef Kiddushin. And that's the ratio of Rabbi Gamliel. The father has to bring a raya in order to establish his ownership as valid on the Kesef Kedushin. So the father's not only coming to prove his rights to collect the ksuba, he's also responsible to prove his chazaka on the Kesef Kedushin as being valid. So kidei lahachzik biyodo mos hakedushin, he has to bring a raya. The Baal wants to claim a return on the Kesef Kedushin because the whole Kedushin was a mekach tos to begin with, and the Kedushin was never chal. So the father has to bring a proof, even in a case where she's already in the Rishus HaBaal. So the suffix was not nolad in the Beis Ha'av, but in the Beis HaBaal, and you would think therefore the Baal has the upper hand over here. No, the Av is going to have to prove his claim, which means his claim both to the Moment HaKedushin and to the Kesef HaKsuba. Why? Because we have a doubt as to whether the Kedushin themselves, what we call the Ikar HaMekach, was valid or not. So we're going to leave the Mammon in the hands of the original Bailin, which means the Marakama, which means in this case the Baal. So the father is going to have to return, he's going to have to cough up the Kesef Kedushin if he doesn't have proof to establish that these women emerged after the Nisuin. So therefore, in the case of a suffix about when the Chamor died, we're going to apply the same logic, and we're going to say the burden of proof is on the shoulders of the Baal HaChamor to prove that his Chamor was alive at the time of the Meshichas HaPara, in order to allow his chazak on the para to be maintained. And if he doesn't have such a raya, he's going to have to return the para to its original bailin. Because whenever there's a suffix on the bailus, like for example here the bailus of the para, we go back to the original owner, to the bailam harishonim, namely the Baal HaPara. And that's exactly why the Baal, in the case of Mumin, has a right to demand that the Av bring a proof to establish his claim, because even though he's holding on to the Moshe Kedushin, but in event that the Mekach, which is a suffix, meaning the Kedushin is a suffix, is non-valid, he has to return those modes. So we see that the power of Cheskas Mammon is greater than Cheskas Haguf. Let's say the Chamar has a Cheskas Haguf who was alive, we want to postpone its death, but connected that, we have the fact that the Kinyan on the Para is in doubt. And if the Kinyan on the Para is in doubt, we tip the scale in favor of the Baal HaPara. Why? Because he has a Cheskas Mammon of Marakama. And now Rav Nachman says, but lo tema liba demand the Omer Kedushin lav l'tibuin nitnu. Right? This only works according to that Mandiomer, that Tanin Baba Basra, who maintains that the Mammon HaKedushin has to be returned in event that the Kedushin does not culminate in Nisuin. But there's another Mandiomer who says that l'tibuin nitnu, which means that the money is given as an absolute gift, such that even if the Baal dies and he never really takes her into the chuppah, nevertheless the most Kedushin remain in the hands of the Isha, and the Yorshim of the Baal could not claim ownership and return of that money. So according to that Shita, even in the case of Kedushay Vadai, the most of Kedushin are a pikadon, right? If you hold lav l'tiburin, if you hold lav l'tiburin nitnu, everything is like frozen and suspended in air over here. That's called a pikadon. He wants his money back if the kedushin does not materialize into nisuin. So the money goes back to the Baal. So therefore, if we have a suffix kedushin, the burden of proof is carried by the father to prove that his claim on the most of kedushin is a valid claim. But if I hold that most kedushin l'tibur nitnu, which means that even in an event that the Baal dies, the most kedushin does not have to be returned, it's given as a gift, then l'chori you would say that even in a case of kedushay tos, where the Baal claims there were movement there before I married her, the money of kedusha would still remain in the hands of the isha, which would mean that according to that sheet of l'tibuin, according to that sheet of lav l'tibuin, Shmuel has no raya from our Mishnah. No, that's not so. Lafilu man di'omer kedushin l'tibuin nitnu hani mili kedushay vada. In other words, we have no something about the erison. The erison is certainly valid, just that the husband died or she died before the nesuin. So in that case, we're going to say l'tibuin nitnu. It's given as a gift because of the erison and its validity. Avol kedushay tos, but when the Baal gave these mos under false premises and the entire kedushin is invalid, then in such a case, we're not going to apply the principle of l'tibur nitnu, and he has a right to get back his mos, even according to that man the Omar. He might see raya, if the father could bring a raya that these women were generated after the erison, then he has rights to hold on to his mos, because otherwise it's a mekach tos and he has to cough up the mos, even if according to man the Omar l'tibur nitnu. If in the event that he can't bring any raya, then we have to worry about the fact that the kedusha might be a kedusha tos. Lo, the father cannot hold on to the mos. He's going to have to return the mos kedusha, because it's suffix whether he has rights to these mos kedusha. And we're going to go back to the chezkas bailim rishonim, which is the Baal in this case, and that's the morakam. Meisvei, the Gemara raises the following kasha on Shmuel from a brisa in Dines Trefus. Now, this brisa in Dine Trefus in Chulin Daf Mem Beis is an overlap of two different issues. One is the issue of Trefus, and the other, which is a spin-off of the issue of Trefus, is the issue of Mekach u'Memkar, in an event that the animal is sold to the buyer is going to actually shech the animal, but under the assumption that it's not a treifa. But what happens is that after the shechita, when they dissect the animal, lo and behold, they find a nekev in the stomach, which is called the beis hakosos. The beis hakosos is that part of the stomach that is covered by two membranes. So machat shenitzis be ovi beis hakosos, but only mitzad echad kshera. Because if it's mitzad echad, then we assume that the other R, I guess you'd call it, is still covering the beis hakosos, and therefore it's not a treifa. So that's a case of mitzad echad where the machat only pierced through one side. That's the inner side of the beis hakosos. So the animal swallowed a needle, and the needle pierced the inner membrane, which is called the dofen apnimis of the beis hakosos, kshera. So that's not a treifa, because the outer exterior Dofen is going to plug up the hole, and the animal is going to survive. However, Mishnei Tzadim, if the nekev was on both sides, it was what we call a nekev mefulash, which means it went straight through from one side of the Beis HaKosos, and we find it protruding on the other side of the Beis HaKosos, treifa. Because then we know that this animal could not have survived its a treifa, because the machat is what's called truva mishnei tzaddim. However, now we're going to qualify this. Even in a case of a machat truva mishnei tzaddim, that doesn't necessarily automatically make the animal into a treifa, because you have to somehow establish that that situation took place while the animal was alive before the shechita. So we need a siman to indicate that the trivas hamacha took place before the shechita, during the lifetime of the animal, and it all depends. Nimtza oleh koret dam, if he finds around the macha, which is truva mishnei tzaddim, a small amount of dam, then we know that this situation of truva took place during the lifetime of the animal, and therefore the dam came out from the mokum triva, and the animal's a treif. However, lo nimtzu alel kored dam, if there's no small amount of dam around the nekev where the machat went in, then biyodua shehu liachar shchita, that the trivas hamachat took place after the shchita. That explains why they didn't find any dam. Lo nimtzu alel kored dam. So then, after the animal was already shechted and it's a dead animal, you can't make it into a treifa. It's a kshera. Now, huglad pia maka is biyadua sheshloshi yomim kodem shchita. If there's already a covering, like a scar, over the maka. Now, again, all this is now relevant to the buyer and the seller. So let's say, for example, the animal was sold to a buyer after already there was trivas machat. So the kona, the buyer, is going to claim, I want my money back from the mocher because this is a mekatos. It's already a treifa. He sold me a treifa. I wanted a kshera. Now, huglad amaka biyadua sheshlosha yomim kodem hashchita, that the triva took place, triva the makkah took place 3 days before the shechita, because within 3 days' time, the gelet is not olal makkah. So if the animal was sold during this 3-day period from the shechita, then the mocher would have to return the money to the lokeh. Why? Because we know that since huglad al pia maka, the machat went in before the shechita. But lo huglad pia maka, now we have no real proof that the trivas hamachat took place before the mechira. Is that amotzi b'chavero override? The lokech wants to get his money back. He has the burden. He carries the burden of proof to bring edim that saw that it was already nichnas machat the Beis HaKosos before the kinyan had taken place. Now that's not something that he can prove, and therefore he's going to lose. He cannot reclaim his money that he paid for the what? For the animal. And now the Gemara is going to be medayik from the language of the Brisa. If you are coming to be motzi the most, then all of a raya, iyoiv tabach domi, If the buyer, he's called a tabach because he shechts the animal. If the buyer already forked over the money to the mocher for this animal, and now he wants to get his money back in return because he's claiming it was a mekatos, and the animal was a treifa. In order to get his money back, the buyer will have to bring a proof. And this is a kasha on Shmuel. Why? Amai, according to Shmuel, who says that if there's a suffix in the mama, then we go back to the original Bailam who has vados. Therefore, even, and that applies, by the way, even in the case where there was no latest suffix in his reshus. So why does the lokeach, who shechts this animal, have the burden of proof for the raya? We should say that the Baal Behema Laisi raya. Why? Because the money originally belonged to the lokeach. So he has the cheskes marakama. Vinokim. The lokeach is the original Bailim Vadoim on these modes. And therefore we should be mamid the most in his chazaka. And where it says Bidelo Yoev Tam Chadami, the case is in this brisa where the lokeach had not yet forked over the money, hadn't yet paid the money. And now the Bala Behema, the mocher, comes to be toveh the money. So the brisa says, "Amotzi b'chaver v'raya." The mocher can't force the lokeach to pay up when this whole sale is besafek. And the most remain in the chazak of the lokeach because he's the Bailam Vadoim, he's the Marakam. So the Gemara immediately asks, my pastor, why did the brisa not qualify this? Where is there a hint in the brisa that the mocher did not receive the money yet? Right? The assumption here in this Gemara's kasha is that many mochrim would not right? So you're telling me he didn't receive the most and he gave over the animal. Well, why would the mocher give over the animal before he gets paid for it? Daniel, thank you so much for setting it up. Yes, and you could go learn, and we'll have the shiur at 8:30. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just finishing my daf yomi shiur on a daf that requires that 20 hours of work.
Thank you.
Correct.
All that contrasts the shower with person.
Eliki also, Rabbi Bar Yechezkel, Omar Lotin Saidinu Lahani Klol. Don't accept all these principles to call you Kudachi Mishmei B'Shmuel. He's arguing against his brothers as to what's the accurate claim in the name of Shmuel. Because Shmuel never said that. I'll tell you what Shmuel said. Kol Shenolad Safek B'Shuso Olav Haraya. Shmuel says it all depends on where the suffix was nolad, in whose reshus. Okay, I apologize for my roads for the interruption.
Necessary for it to go through this.
There should be a way of solving that problem. Like everything else. So I don't, in other words, on that side, in the shul, I don't know how to do that. In any event,
but
the Bala Para has to bring a raya.
Because when it went through Asar Mamoris, it does.
And why is that?
It does.
Because
in way of passage. In other words, it's just a.
Daniel, can you hear me, Daniel?
It's a train that's passing through.
I guess he doesn't hear me.
Not a. Okay. Doesn't make a stop there.
So what do I do now?
It's using that tunnel
to get to. You to something like that. Let me see.
Wonderful day. מצאנו גם גאון וגם עורך דין ברגע שנכנסנו.
Oh, is that any better? Okay, I think at least on my side, that's an improvement. Okay. Could be I'll have to change that when I get over to there. I don't know. So again, now we have a new formulation of Shmuel. And Shmuel is saying, Kol hanolad safek b'shuso, olav haraya. If the suffix was nolad in the Bailus, the Rishus of so-and-so, all of a raya. So therefore, the Balapara is the one who has to bring the raya. The exact opposite of everything that we've been saying for the last hour, that according to Shmuel, the Balachamar has to bring the raya. Pum fakir. It's the Balapara who has to bring the raya. Why? Because the moment that the Balachamar makes the Mashiach on the para, the Chamar is automatically considered to be in the Rishus of the Balapara. So the suffix in his is in his Rishus. So the burden of proof is carried by the Balapara to prove that the Chamar was already dead. Tuna, now we understand very well the raya that Shmuel brings from the Mishnah of Kala. And we're assuming the Mishnah is like Rava, back on Ayin Hey, that the entirety of this Mishnah is attributed, is authored by Rabbi Gamliel. And from the two dinim of the Mishnah, we're going to prove Shmuel. Right? Nimtza amumin bebeis ha'av. If we find the mumin while she's still in the beis ha'av, ala av lahavi raya. Right? And Rava was insisting on the principle of kan nimtzu, but kan hayu, which means that she always had these mumin from Sheish Yismei Breishis. It all depends on where the suffix was nolad. And that's exactly what Shmuel wants to derive from that Mishnah with regard to the Balapar, that the Balapar has to bring the raya because the suffix was nolad in the Rishus of the Balapara. Because the very moment that the Balachamar made that Mashiach on the Para, we assume that the Chamar is in the Rishus of the Balapara, and therefore the Chamar in the Rishus of Balapara is the latest HaSofik, and hence the Balapara has to bring the right. And both dinim of our Mishnah of Kala, authored by Rabbi Gamliel in the interpretation of Rava, will support Shmuel. Beisvei, so the Gemara asks, Machat Shenimtzeis Biovi Beis HaKosos. Right, it would seem that Hamotzi Mechavel of a Raya, the lo yoiv tabach dami, if the buyer did not pay the money, bala behema boy lasuye raya. It's the mocher who has to bring the raya. Umapik ramai sfeik rishus tabach is yalid. According to this reformulation of Shmuel, the suffix was nolad in the rishus of the lokeach of the shochet. When did they discover the machet? After they dissected the animal after shkita, and therefore, according to Shmuel, the raya should be imposed and carried by the lokeach. So more answers the yoyev tabach dami umay paska. The milsa kama de lo yoyev inish zuzi lo yoyev inish chivasa. The mocher would not give over the animal until he received the damim, and if he already received the damim, and now the lokeach wants to prove that he was given a treifa, then olav lahavi raya. He's going to have to bring the raya. And this leads us to the Chachamim Omrim, 2 lines up before the end of the Amud. And that's where Mirza Hashem, what day of the week is tomorrow? Wednesday? We'll pick it up on Wednesday. The only thing is we have to learn a little bit earlier tomorrow, let's say at around 7 in Mirza Hashem. It could be 7:15, whatever suits you. And
7 o'clock is very good tomorrow. Yeah.
Excellent. So we'll go with 7 o'clock.
Perfect.
Okay, good. So I'm not going to close this down right now because I don't want to mess up the. So the next year, if you want to join us, is a shir on shofar for Rosh Hashanah. If you have the time. Okay. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Bye.